America has been plagued with unspeakable crimes and unexplained phenomena that have captured nationwide attention and intrigue, demanding answers and retribution. However, many of these mysteries never get explained. Mysteries to this day that are still thwarting the best efforts of countless law enforcement and investigative teams. Serial killers never identified. Treasures lost. Murderers never caught. And conspiracy upon conspiracy spinning into tangled webs of inconclusive evidence and unresolved truths. This compelling documentary series presents a countdown of America's 60 most notorious unsolved mysteries and crimes in a dramatic compilation revealing these unanswered questions in 10 fascinating episodes. America's greatest unsolved mysteries, 19 through 14, are a bizarre blend of brutal murders, skyway robbery, lost riches, and lost colonies. Croatoan, Croatoan, the founding of America. The founding of our great nation began with the mystery of this word.
America's real first unsolved mystery was our very first colony when the British came here in 1587 and started the colony on Roanoke Island.
Roanoke Colony was a 16th century business venture concocted by one of England's leading adventurers, Sir Walter Raleigh. What kind of business venture? A risky business venture. Raleigh persuaded Queen Elizabeth and leading London merchants to back his scheme of founding a colony and striking it rich in the New World. In 1587, the swashbuckling adventurer outfitted the expedition and sent it off to the rugged coast of present-day Virginia.
The colonists landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina in 1587. That was 20 years before John Smith reached Jamestown and 35 years before the Pilgrims reached Massachusetts. John White, the governor, stayed for the birth of his granddaughter, and then he set sail for England to arrange for more supplies. He returned 3 years later and found everyone was gone. 90 men, 17 women, 9 children disappeared.
There was no sign that they'd been attacked. The village was just abandoned. There was no sign really that any kind of violence had occurred. There was no sign that they'd even take much of anything with them. There were only 2 clues left behind. The word CRO, which he found carved, and then the word Croatoan that was carved on a wooden plank. Now, this was supposed to have been a signal that the settlers had to, for whatever reason, leave the village. Well, he assumed they were then gone to live with the Croatoan Indians, who hadn't seen any sign of them. That was one of the few allies they still had left. After a search was done among the Indians and anywhere that the settlers could have gone, there was just simply no trace of them. And then with hurricane season setting in, White packed up, sailed back to England, and left, if the settlers were still out there, left them behind. They were never found. Years later, John Smith, famous explorer and settler in Virginia, went to look for any sign of the settlers, and he never found them either. To this day, we don't know where they went or what happened to them, whether they left because they were attacked by other Indians, whether they starved to death. We simply just don't know.
How is it possible for 116 English colonists to simply vanish without a trace?
All sorts of solutions to this mystery have been proposed. The colonists could have been lost at sea while they were trying to get back to England, but they didn't have any boat big enough to sail to England. Or the Spanish could have killed them. But there's documentary evidence, that the Spaniards were still looking for the lost colony as late as 1600. Or they could have been killed by or joined a nearby Indian tribe. But who and where?
I would say that they ended up moving somewhere to live with another Indian tribe. There were stories that were told later of fair-haired, blue-eyed Indians that were found many years later, lineage-wise, among the Virginia settlers, the colonists who came later, that there were pale-skinned Indians who may have been, descendants of some people from the lost colony.
Croatoan. Croatoan. It's a mystery still looking for an answer after 400 years. The legend of D.B. Cooper, the gentle airplane hijacker, the anti-hero who in 1971 got away with $200,000 in ransom and disappeared without a trace.
The story of D.B. Cooper is such an unsolved mystery because, unlike people like Butch Cassidy or Billy the Kid, we don't know anything about D.B. Cooper. I mean, obviously, it wasn't even his name. He got onto an airplane using a fake name, which you could do back then. You couldn't get away with that kind of thing these days, but back then you could get onto a plane using a fake name. He was very nondescript, dark hair, sunglasses, and a suit. Was all anybody ever remembered about him afterward. He was very innocuous man, didn't cause any attention to be brought to himself, of course, until it came time to hijack the plane, land it, take away a $200,000 ransom and a parachute.
So, who is D.B. Cooper? The hijacker boarded the plane using the alias Dan Cooper. He wore dark sunglasses and a nice clean suit and tie. After the 727 took off from the Portland airport, he handed a note to a young flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. It read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You're being hijacked." The note also demanded $200,000 in unmarked bills and 4 parachutes. Cooper opened his briefcase long enough for Schaffner to see that the bomb was real. He instructed her to tell the pilot not to land until the money and parachutes were ready at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. While the flight circled Puget Sound, Cooper smoked cigarettes, drank whiskey, and generally was a cheery soul, all adding to his legend as a gentleman bandit. On the ground, the government gathered up $200,000 in unmarked bills and the parachutes. Upon landing, passengers were released in exchange for the money and parachutes. Then the plane took off. After traveling a short distance, D.B. Cooper jumped from the plane into a forested area like this. Curiously, not far from where the original flight took off. What happened next is the mystery.
I'm not sure that he survived the leap from the aircraft sometime after his jump from the hijacked airplane with the ransom money. Some of the cash was found in the woods. And since then there have been 2 or 3 different people that came forward and tried to identify their relatives as D.B. Cooper, but again, no DNA traces were found from him on the plane, so there's really nothing to match unless the perpetrator did confess. Still, it hasn't been that long ago. He could still be alive, but why he would come forward at this point would be anybody's guess. He'd really have to be an idiot.
The FBI claims that he didn't survive the jump, but why wouldn't he have survived the jump? That's always sort of been my question. I could never figure out a reason why he wouldn't have gotten away with it. He was a completely unknown entity. I mean, no one knew anything about him. He was a zero kind of profile. So the fact that he could take a parachute and jump out of a plane and disappear into the wilderness, why not? I've never been able to understand why people think he died. Now, I know that most of the money has never turned up, but some of it has, which makes you wonder if some of it turned up, then what happened to the rest of it? It could have easily been taken out of the country. We'd never know about it, especially in the 1970s.
And so the legend of D.B. Cooper lives on.
Nobody knew when this happened that it was going to become such a celebrated missing persons case, I guess. That it would become, the butt of jokes for years and years to come, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. When things turn up missing, people say, oh, did you find Jimmy Hoffa?
Part of what's intriguing about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is that Hoffa himself was such an intriguing figure. Was he, as Robert Kennedy once called him, the leader of a conspiracy of evil, a union leader who sold out the Teamsters to gangsters and racketeers? Or was he, as many of the Teamsters believed, a union leader who stood up for the drivers? His name was James R. Hoffa, and the R, this is true, stood for Riddle.
The Teamster boss stood at the center of the country's greatest riddles. Did the mob try to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro? Who killed John F. Kennedy? Who killed Robert Kennedy? What was in Nixon's 18-and-a-half-minute gap on the Watergate tapes? In every conspiracy of the 60s, somewhere Hoffa is present. Hoffa is the one who knew where all the bodies were buried. For the mob, the CIA, and even Richard Nixon. Hoffa was a short, powerful bulldog of a man, and one of the most controversial of the leaders who ran the United States in the 60s. On the one hand, he shepherded the International Brotherhood of Teamsters from a small backwater union of 75,000 men in 1932 to the most powerful union in the country by 1961. At the same time, he was ruthless. Would even kill you with his bare hands if you dared or were stupid enough to cross him. His cutthroat instincts made him a perfect fit with the mob. In fact, Hoffa's mob ties went back to the 40s. He used mob enforcers to get lucrative contracts for his Teamsters. Hoffa repaid the favors after the mob moved into Las Vegas. Teamster Cash built Caesar's Palace and Circus Circus. Though, interestingly, on Caesar's opening night, Hoffa was unimpressed with his investment.
Funny thing about Jimmy Hoffa, that he really wasn't into Las Vegas personally. Yet there's a great story about him that the night Caesars opened, ancient Rome should have bacchanalia, you know, and this was bacchanalia. I mean, enormous amounts of champagne and high-end food. And it was not a good night for the casino, and they were losing money. And Hoffa had come out for the opening. It was not really his scene. He had gone up to bed. And supposedly the operators of Caesar's Palace had to go to his room and say, "Mr. Hoffa, you've lent us a lot of money. We need $1 million more to get through the night." And Hoffa's response was basically, "Well, I went this far with you, okay." But the fact that they had to go to Hoffa's room because Hoffa wasn't really interested in the action downstairs, it's, in a sense, there's a dichotomy here.
Hoffa's influence with the mob didn't stop with Las Vegas. He had it in for the Kennedy brothers, John and Robert.
To conspiracy theorists, the assassinations and the attempted assassinations of Kennedy, of Castro, of Hoffa, they were all entangled. Hoffa hated JFK, not as much as he hated his brother Robert, but plenty. And a Hoffa aide once reported that Hoffa had said that he wanted to kill that son of a bitch, Robert Kennedy. That wasn't the only connection between the Kennedy assassination and Hoffa. Jack Ruby, who shot Oswald, was the number 2 man in a Teamster affiliate run by a friend of Jimmy Hoffa.
Mob lawyer Frank Regano was also Hoffa's lawyer. In 1992, Regano confessed in an interview that back in 1963, Hoffa wanted a favor. He carried a message from Jimmy Hoffa to mob bosses Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello to take out President Kennedy. In 1964, the tougher-than-nails Hoffa was convicted of bribery and fraud and finally went to prison in 1967. But that didn't stop him from running the Teamsters through his hand-picked representative, Frank Fitzsimmons. Tired of prison life, Hoffa worked to deal with Richard Nixon in 1971.
Of course, Jimmy Hoffa being embroiled in an attempt to come back and take over the Teamsters Union at a time when he'd been released from prison by his good friend Richard Nixon on the condition that he stay out of union affairs for 10 years. But Hoffa, I think, was definitely threatening to spill the beans if he wasn't allowed back into union affairs. And so he was taken for a ride somewhere. There's at least half a dozen theories about whether he ended up buried in a stadium or melted down into a car and sent to Japan, ground up into dog food, or whatever it may be.
Hoffa's sudden disappearance from the parking lot of his favorite Detroit restaurant, the Macus Red Fox, has made him the center of his own riddle. Where is Jimmy Hoffa?
Is Jimmy Hoffa pushing up Giant Stadium, or is he someplace else buried in concrete? I'm sure he's certainly encased in concrete someplace. I can't believe that, I don't think Jimmy Hoffa is living in the Cayman Islands, a happy old man who escaped the careworn days as a Teamster leader. I think he's definitely a rub-out victim.
Who took him and where he went have made him the center of his own conspiracy for the last 35 years.
It wasn't too long a jump from Hoffa the assassin to Hoffa as target. The logic went like this. The Mafia wanted Castro dead because he was bad for business in Cuba. The CIA wanted Castro dead for political reasons. So Castro, in revenge for either the Mafia or the CIA attempts on his life, killed Kennedy. Or maybe the Mafia killed Kennedy in revenge for Robert Kennedy's anti-crime crusade. Whatever the reason, Hoffa knew about it, so then the Mafia had to kill Hoffa to make sure he didn't talk about it.
There's no proof as to who off to Jimmy Hoffa, but I think that it's hard to imagine that the leadership of the Teamsters and the mob guys that they were connected with weren't really responsible for that, because they were the people who had the most to gain from getting rid of Hoffa and him going away.
At that time, there was really no difference between the mob and the Teamsters per se. Supposedly, Hoffa left a note behind that he was meeting Anthony Provenzano for lunch at the Red Fox restaurant outside Detroit. Provenzano being, of course, both a made man of the Mafia and a Teamster official. So during Hoffa's regime, the Teamsters were so heavily infested with mobsters they were almost indistinguishable, which of course got them thrown out of the AFL-CIO for about 2 decades. The only leverage Hoffa would really have would be to reveal the whole nexus of mob Teamster operations, which at the time he disappeared in 1975 also would have blown the whistle on very possibly illegal donations to the Nixon administration when Richard Nixon was still in power. It was to everybody's advantage except Jimmy's for him to disappear.
Jimmy Hoffa, with his, celebrated ties to the Mafia, probably ended up somewhere in a hole that we'll never know where it was. And there have been a number of people who claim they've killed him. Now, of course, they couldn't have all done it, but several of them claim that they have. So there have been a lot of stories that he was either buried under a swimming pool, thrown in a gravel pit. I've heard that he's been buried in fields in Michigan, underneath a motor garage in Detroit. To this day, though, no trace of Jimmy Hoffa has ever been found. What happened to him? Who knows? My guess would be that he made some enemies that he shouldn't have made, and that was the last we'll ever see or hear of Jimmy Hoffa.
I learned this as a kid. We would walk along I grew up not far from Fall River, and we'd walk along with a stick, making a noise against a metal fence. Lizzie Borden had an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
The axe murders of Andrew Borden and his wife Abby started something big in America: the unsolved murder mystery. On August 4th, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, Andrew and his wife were found brutally axed to death in their home. The trial of their daughter, Lizzie Borden, for the murders was America's first big media trial. A trial that kicked off America's fascination and obsession with sensational legal proceedings. And we mustn't forget about the phenomena of haunted houses, slasher novels, and movies. Here's the cast of characters in and around the Borden 2nd Street home on that fateful day. Lizzie, of course. Her father and stepmother, Andrew Jackson Borden and his second wife, Abby Durfee Borden. The family maid, Bridget Sullivan. Lizzie's sister, Emma Borden. John Vinicum Morse, brother of Andrew Borden's first wife. And an illegitimate paternal half-brother named William Borden.
Lizzie actually finds her father's body in the living room. His skull has been bashed in. She calls the maid down, and while other people come over, while they're trying to kind of comfort her and everything, they find her mother's body, her stepmother's body, in an upstairs bedroom. It turns out that they've both had their skulls cracked with an axe, with a hatchet, The stepmother got 19 blows to the head. The father got 11 blows to the head. And there was bad blood in the household before this happened between Lizzie and her sister and the father and stepmother. There were some issues concerning the disposition of property and what the father was going to do with the property. There'd been an argument of some kind that morning. Lizzie was the only child of the family who was home. The parents are found murdered. Lizzie Borden goes on trial.
I don't think Lizzie Borden actually committed the murders, but I do believe that she knew who did and that she was involved in what happened afterward. Lizzie was put on trial and tried and found innocent, which everybody seems to forget when we think of Lizzie Borden. We think of this spinster axe murderer, but she was actually found innocent by a jury of her peers. But I do think that she did know what was going on. According to a lot of some of the history records and theories, Andrew Borden actually had an illegitimate son who was mentally ill, who lived in Fall River. And it's believed by some, and I would have to agree with this, based on some of the things I've seen, that he's the one who actually committed the murders.
Did Lizzie Borden really do it? It's interesting to note that in 1892, the one piece of evidence that might have proven this would have been fingerprint evidence. Fingerprint evidence is pretty new at the time. The Fall River police refused to test for fingerprints on the hatchet handle, so that they don't actually know if Lizzie Borden's fingerprints were on there. So there wasn't a lot of forensic evidence. That's why she wasn't convicted. The clue to me is the stepmother has 19 blows to the head. The father has 11 blows to the head. So this is somebody who's angry. Like if you're trying to kill somebody, to rob them or to do something, you hit them once or twice, you knock them out maybe a third time to really be sure you haven't done. When you get to 19 times, you're in a pretty huge rage. And so I think Lizzie Borden is a very likely candidate for actually having committed this murder, even though she was acquitted of it. So maybe she didn't give her mother 40 whacks, maybe she didn't give her father 41 whacks, but I think she gave them enough whacks to end their lives.
Lizzie never spoke about the murders. She never spoke in her own defense at the trial. She never uttered a word. She never claimed, she never said she was innocent, but she certainly never spoke about any knowledge that she had of the murders other than what she gave to the police during the investigation, that she had gone out to the barn to look for lead to make sinkers to go fishing with. That's where she claimed she was when the murders took place. Other than that, that's the only real alibi she ever gave. So someone else, my guess would be, committed these murders. Because I don't think Lizzie could have done it because, for one thing, anybody who had done it would have been covered in blood. Lizzie didn't have a drop of blood anywhere on her. She was wearing the same dress she'd been wearing that morning when the police came. There was no blood. There have been some who claim that she had stripped naked, and that's how she committed the murders without getting blood on her, but they don't explain how she could have washed it off so quickly and why no trace of it was ever found. So I really don't think she committed the murders, but again, we don't really know who did.
Doubt. All good unsolved mysteries end in doubt. At the ripe old age of 66, Lizzie Borden took her knowledge of that gruesome murder 35 years before to her grave. Located east of Phoenix, Arizona, is a rough, mountainous region where many people have gone looking for an incomparable treasure, the Lost Dutchman Mine. Gone looking only to never be seen again. Or worse, found dead. This is a haunting place of mystery, of legend and lore, and it is called appropriately the Superstition Mountains. What powerful energies inhabit these rocky crags? What has caused dozens of people who seek the lost mine to vanish without a trace? Does the mine belong to the Apache thunder god, who will kill anyone trying to pillage its treasure? Or are these deaths caused by the spirits of those who have died seeking the mine's gold and silver? The Lost Dutchman mine story has appeared 6 times more often in books and movies than the next 2 lost treasure legends combined. Troy Taylor has written a book on the Lost Dutchman mine, and he knows the facts well.
The Lost Dutchman mine, I think, is probably one of the strangest stories to come out of the Southwest. I mean, the West is filled with stories of lost gold and silver mines, but there's something about the Lost Dutchman that really appeals to people. It had been around long before it gained the name of the Dutchman. It was supposed to have been a Mexican family, the Peraltas. It was supposed to be their glorious silver mine that they had mined, untold riches out of, and was later discovered in the middle 1800s by this German man named Jacob Waltz, who took the secret of its location to his deathbed. But there have been scores of maps and people who have searched for it and have gone off into the Superstition Mountains and have just never come back. In fact, there's a pretty long list of people who went out there and were either murdered or met with terrible accidents, to the point that many people believe that if not the mine, then the superstitions themselves are cursed. They got that name because the Indians believed that the dark gods lived in those mountains. I think maybe as a way to keep the white man from wandering in. We'll never know. But the location of the mine, despite many clues, has just simply never been found. I do think it's out there. It's out there somewhere. There have been too many documented evidences of people bringing out silver from this mine. Oftentimes don't know where it came from or have not survived to explain where it came from. And I think it's one of those things that so many people have died looking for it that it's become almost a larger than life lost mine. But do I think it's real? Absolutely. It's out there somewhere. I've always thought it was one of those places I'd love to go look for, until I read that list of all the people who've died looking for it, and then think maybe it's not such a good idea after all.
It all started when Elisha Rivas, better known as the Madman of the Superstitions, was found dead in 1896, head severed from his body. 14 years later, a Mormon prospector was found in the Superstitions, babbling incoherently. Later, a woman's body was discovered in a cave, and near her corpse was a pile of golden nuggets. And the list goes on. In June of 1931, Adolph Ruth from Washington, D.C., left for the Superstition foothills with what he claimed was an old Peralta map to the mine. When a search party came across his fresh campsite, Ruth was nowhere to be seen. Then in December, his skull turned up on Blacktop Mountain with 2 holes in it. An accident? Or did he find the lost mine? Something he wasn't supposed to do. In 1937, an old prospector named Guy Hematite Frink came down from the mountain with some rich gold samples. That following November, he was found shot in the stomach on the side of a trail. A small sack of gold ore was discovered beside him. His death was ruled an accident. In June 1947, a prospector named James A. Cravey made a much-publicized trip into the Superstition Canyons by helicopter, searching for the Lost Dutchman mine. The pilot set him down in LaBarge Canyon, close to Weaver's Needle. When Cravey failed to hike out as planned, a search was started, and although his camp was found, Cravey was not. The following February, His headless skeleton was found in a canyon. In February 1951, Dr. John Burns, a physician from Oregon, was found shot to death in the Superstitions. In January 1961, a family picnicking near the edge of the mountain discovered the body of Hilmer Charles Bowen, buried beneath the sand. He was a Utah prospector who had been shot in the back. 2 months later, another prospector, Walter J. Mowry from Denver, was found shot to death in the Superstitions. And there are many more cases of death and disappearances of people looking for the mine, often looking with a newly discovered map leading to the cursed treasure.
Well, there have been a lot of maps that have floated around from people who claim that they have, bought it from someone who knew where the mine was, and that was the maps usually came along a lot in the early 1900s. People claim they had the Peralta maps, that the family maps had somehow been, worked out, because there are a few clues, the needle-like rock and the certain canyons, and there are a few clues, and people work those into maps, and I think it's easier to make money selling somebody a map than to actually go looking for the mine. A lot safer anyway.
So, if you've ever wanted to solve one of America's great unsolved mysteries, here's your chance.
The Black Dahlia, and what a gruesome murder that was. She was cut in half, her torso was severed, and if you look at the pictures, her top half is a few feet away from her bottom half, found in a vacant lot.
Film noir. That unique Hollywood genre that captures the essence of LA. Crime dramas. Crime dramas that are rich with cynical attitudes and sexual motivations. Film noir. Low-key black and white, hard-edged shadows, a visual style with its roots in German Expressionism. Film noir. A period stretching from the early 1940s to the late 1950s. Film noir. Hatched from the hard-boiled school of crime fiction that emerged in the United States during the Depression. Elizabeth Short was a child of that depression, a lost soul drifting through Los Angeles. Her gruesome murder and mutilated body became the quintessential film noir expression of America's desires and fears. In real life, Elizabeth Short was a nobody. Her friends called her Beth, but she preferred Betty. Finally, she escaped her dreary East Coast life and moved to Hollywood in pursuit of her dream, like so many others, to become a starlet. On January 9th, 1947, this raven-haired beauty was last seen in the lobby of LA's Biltmore Hotel. 6 days later, on January 15th, a mother walking with her 3-year-old daughter saw what she thought was a broken doll in a vacant lot. It was Elizabeth Short, soon to be nicknamed the Black Dahlia.
She was found brutally murdered in a way that hadn't been seen in Hollywood prior to that. She'd been mutilated before she died. She'd been beaten, and her body was cut in half. And she was found in 2 pieces, thrown in an empty lot in Hollywood.
In addition to being totally naked, she was posed with her legs spread, and the corners of her mouth cut so that they extended to each ear. The bloody gashes forming a gruesome smile.
I think it really captured the public imagination because even in an open town like Los Angeles, even in a day and age when crime reporting was pretty vivid and bloody bodies splashed all over the newspapers, this one really stood out. Who did it? I don't know, but boy, that's a mystery that I would still like to see solved. I mean, that's one that stays with me.
After she was discovered and people began finding out more and more about her, the press created the name the Black Dahlia based on the movie at the time, the Blue Dahlia. And she became something that was, something that we've never really seen anything like it since then. To this day, the murder has never been solved. I don't even think anyone has a credible theory as to who did it. There have been several people who have investigated or have proposed they might know who the murderer is, but I don't really think I've seen anything that I think is completely credible.
Oh, the Black Dahlia's murder is one of my favorites. I co-authored a book in 1994 with Janice Knowlton, who accused her father of being the killer. His name was George Knowlton, and she recalled from childhood accompanying him on various outings where several women were killed, not only Elizabeth Short, but some when they lived in Massachusetts and then later out in California. She also accused him of killing Geneva Elroy, who's the mother of novelist James Elroy. And although, I wasn't alive then either, we tracked George Knowlton's path across the country, and I'm as convinced as I can be that he was involved in a series of unsolved murders. A few years later, an individual named Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective, popped up and accused his father of being the murderer, and of course he's also named George, the significance being that Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, was said to be meeting a boyfriend named George who the police never identified. And of course Hodel has now gone on to accuse his father not only of being the Black Dahlia killer, but the Zodiac as well up in California, which is a total anomaly. Serial killers don't change their methods like that. But a very captivating case as far as the body cut in half and left out on the vacant lot in Los Angeles. Another author named Wolf blames the murder on the mafia, claims that Bugsy Siegel cut Elizabeth Short in two as a warning to his mafia rival Jack Dragna, who was running prostitutes in the city, and Siegel was trying to squeeze him out. And then Wolf claims that Dragna turned around and assassinated Siegel to get even for the Black Dahlia murder, which happened 6 months before Siegel was killed. So there's a theory that fits everybody's pleasure on that one.
I mean, this was a huge manhunt. I mean, they had thousands of tips. They had the Los Angeles police force going nuts trying to figure out who this is, and they never did. I wonder. I mean, it's impossible to believe that somebody who would commit a crime like that wouldn't commit more. That it must have been somebody. Almost seems likely that it would be somebody that killed a lot of other people.
The closest I think I've seen, John Gilmore did a book called Severed. And there was an interview that he had done with a man who he believed was the Black Dahlia killer, who conveniently died in an apartment fire just a short time before he was supposed to give Gilmore a big interview that was going to really expose some secrets. So again, we're kind of left with maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. I think probably the worst one I've seen was the guy who claims that his father was the Black Dahlia killer. There's not only is it completely hard to believe, but it's all so wildly tied together, and he's got photographs he claims of the Black Dahlia, which really, I mean, I'm no photographic expert, but I'm pretty sure they're not her.
I personally think that George Knowlton probably did it. I'm as sure as I can be based on the evidence of his involvement in other crimes and his eventual murder-suicide where he killed himself and his youngest son in a car crash in Oklahoma in 1961. Certainly his conversations with other people, the fact that he sexually abused his own children, that he was known to be violent with his wives and so forth, makes him as good for it, in my opinion, as anybody else.
Even the famous have been accused of killing the Black Dahlia. Woody Guthrie, Orson Welles, and Norman Chandler, publisher of the LA Times. In contrast to the cheery Hollywood sign, the murder of the Black Dahlia will forever remain the noir homage to the dark and shadowy side of Tinseltown.